due to the problem of moral hazard, and also due to other incentive problems, designing welfare programs is not an easy task. The fundamental problem is that people always know more about themselves, about their preferences, their earnings potential, their needs, than the government does. And so they can themselves, for example, decide how much they value leisure and how much they want to work, and without the government being able to figure out who's who. And so what that means is that due to moral hazard and due to other incentive problems, there are always trade-offs when a government wants to design welfare programs. These are almost unavoidable. In some societies, these trade-offs may be smaller, for example, because work ethics differ, because of cultural differences, and so on. But so, and I don't want to say at all here that people who don't work are lazy or anything like that. But we should be aware that those trade-offs are present, and governments designing welfare programs need to take them into account. And when in doing so, governments typically face several dilemmas. And these are summarized, it's actually a trilemma, by this, what was called the iron triangle of welfare programs. So the thing is that here are three goals of welfare programs. The one is you want to encourage that people actually work, that they don't rely on welfare programs. On the other hand, you want to redistribute income and wealth from those with high incomes and high wealth to those with less income, less wealth. And at the same time, you want this to be cost effective, as in you want to reduce the cost for government. Now, the problem is that only 2 out of those 3 goals can be simultaneously achieved. Now, let's think about this for a second. So suppose you want to design a welfare program that at the same time encourages work and redistributes a lot of income. That program is inevitably very costly. Here is why. The reason is that if I want to redistribute a lot, but at the same time encourage people to work, I basically need to do research and try and extract the information on people's preferences from them and then target the benefits to them, right? Because otherwise I will have the problem that we've seen in the last video, that a lot of people who value leisure a lot, they may simply choose not to work. So if I want to encourage work, I would have to try and pinpoint that group and then specifically target the benefits towards that group to the extent that this is legally possible. But getting there can be quite expensive. Take another example. If your goal is to redistribute a lot and have this at the same time, cheap for government, that's the flip side of the coin, then it's very, very hard to provide the right incentive to work. Or if we want to say, well, let's encourage work, but do this very cheaply, well, then the simple answer is we simply have very low benefit rates, and that means not much redistribution. Right? So these 3 goals are hard to, or are almost impossible to achieve at the same time. And so every government has to then decide, well, on what side of the trade-off do we stand? And more broadly, every society has to decide that. Okay? Now, there are ways to get us around this iron triangle, or at least address and solve some of the trade-offs that are in. The one is to have categorical welfare payments. So to have welfare payments that specifically target certain people or certain groups. To have ordeal mechanisms, which we will encounter in a couple of slides, where basically the idea is that relying on welfare, well, you are entitled, but if you rely on it, there is some social stigma, or it's very unpleasant to do so. And the last one is to increase the outside options. Right? So if, for example, wages were a lot higher in the private sector, then that would mean that that the opportunity cost of leisure would be very high, and even people who value leisure a lot would obviously. But so the third option is obviously a tough one for government to do. It would rather be the case if there was some, I don't know, technological progress or something that increases people's outside options, people's wages a lot. And so each of those would reduce the amount of moral hazard because it gives people less of an incentive to either make themselves look poor and then rely on those benefits, or it makes it hard for them to do so, right? So simply put, if I have categorical welfare payments, it may not be easy for me to manipulate that category, right? So for example, one example is child benefit. So I either have children or I don't have children. The children are, in most cases, registered with the government, and I can't just pretend to have a child. I need to have proof, and it has to, cannot just easily pretend to have a child. The same goes to some degree with disability benefits. So people with disabilities, they have to get proof of that if they want to avail of disability benefits, and getting that proof is not as easy as just sending in a form and getting that proof. But you need to get examined and whatever else is involved. Right? So then if you have welfare payments that are specifically for people with disabilities, you can immediately exclude all the other people who could otherwise just pretend to have a disability to get those benefits. Whereas if you ask for a proof, then that's obviously a lot harder. And so you can target your benefits to exactly the group where you want them to be, namely those people who actually have a disability. Okay? So that's the idea between a categorical welfare payment. Right? So the government wants to redistribute to poor people, but people can, through their choice of how much to work, they can make themselves look poor. It's for the government, it's impossible to say, well, who is poor but could actually earn a lot more if only they work more, and who is poor but couldn't escape that. Okay? So if the government could target earnings capacity rather than actual earnings, there would be no moral hazard. But that's either costly or impossible, right? So you can get some way there by trying to extract from people how much they are willing to work, and in advanced microeconomics, you would learn about incentive compatible contracts that would allow governments to reduce the amount of moral hazard, but to eliminate is hard. So one thing that is done a lot is targeting, so categorical welfare payments to certain groups, and so these typically target groups with low incomes. Child benefits is a different case here because it basically for anyone who's a parent, regardless of the income. But then others, for example, benefits to single mothers or to people with disabilities. There is obviously, these are obviously targeted at people who have a low earnings capacity, because either they have to look after a child and can't work that much, or through a disability, that may keep them from earning more. But there is always, and in any country where you have those measures, there will always be the discussion whether they encourage a certain behavior. So in the US, there is actually a lot of discussion about people abusing disability benefits, so that people who actually don't have a disability or only a very light one are pretending to have a stronger one in order to get more benefits. Whether that's true or not is a different question, but there is this discussion. There used to be also a discussion about single motherhood. You can also hear this sometimes in Ireland, that if there are benefits to single mothers, that encourages people to mothers to rather declare that they're single rather than getting married, father of the child. Now, when you look at the data, this is now just the example of how economists would look at that. I mean, this is not a found economic analysis. This is eyeballing of what happened in time series. Okay, so we can't really claim causality here. But what you can see here is the red line is the amount of welfare benefits that is given to families. And a family is obviously the household with the child. So if you're a single parent, that means that your household gets, that may actually be quite advantageous. It benefits per family. And so broadly speaking, the welfare benefits have gone down over time, but it has not discouraged or has not encouraged people to become single parents, right? So single parenthood went up for many reasons, cultural reasons, and so on. This obviously single parenthood in the 2000s was socially a lot more acceptable than it would have been in the 1960s, 70s. But it went up despite the benefits going down. So if you wanted to make the argument that higher benefits encourage single motherhood, at least the data don't seem to indicate. Right? Obviously, if you wanted to make a very strong causal claim here, you would need to have a more profound analysis. But the first approximation, the data don't seem to show that. And now another way of solving the moral hazard issue, but obviously a very controversial one, are so-called ordeal mechanisms. So the idea is to make welfare receipt socially very costly to people, make it really unattractive to rely on welfare. So what that means then is that only those who absolutely need it would bear that cost. So an example for that are soup kitchens or food banks, where it's clearly unpleasant for people to queue up in order to get food for free or for a very reduced price. And so either it pays only for the poorest to wait that long in line, or there is this social stigma. And so for that reason, that the welfare benefit, in this case food, would only be taken advantage of by those people who absolutely need it. Now, this is obviously not something that we all wish that governments did, but to some extent it happens. And also in the public debate, you hear politicians and political groups sometimes advocating that. And the reason why they advocate it is because it's also one way of solving that inherent moral hazard problem in welfare programs. That it's controversial, I don't think anyone disputes that. But the fact of the matter is there are social costs that come with any welfare programs, and there are multiple ways of reducing these social costs or redistributing those social costs. Right? In some cases, the social costs are borne by the taxpayers. In other cases, such as the ordeal mechanisms, the social costs are simply borne by those people who either take advantage of those and receive welfare, but for who this has a very high individual cost, or for those who would otherwise go to a food bank but feel that the social stigma is too high and as such have to do a lot less. Right? The bottom line here is there is no such thing as a free lunch, literally, with welfare programs. We have to face trade-offs, and an important role for economists and for other social scientists is to highlight what those trade-offs are, to understand how big they are, and then to hopefully also provide solutions for them.